1978, pretty Vancouver teenager Dorothy Hoogstraten was working at a local Dairy Queen, thinking she'd become a secretary once she graduated high school. Within a year, she was in the pages of Playboy Magazine. By April of 1980, she was named Playmate of the Year. By August of that same year, Dorothy would be brutally murdered by the man who promised to love her until death did them part. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love, and this week I'm putting a spotlight on the case I'm calling Death of a Golden Girl. Dorothy Ruth Hoogstraten was born in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1960, the first child of Dutch immigrants Simon and Nellie Hoogstraten, and a brother John would follow in 1961. According to the A&E biography about Dorothy, the marriage between Simon, who was a carpenter, and Nellie was not a happy one, and when Dorothy was 3 years old, Simon took off, leaving the family for another woman. Nellie would go on to remarry, and little sister Louise would round out the family in 1968. Unfortunately, Nellie had found herself in another bad marriage, with her abusive husband breaking her son John's arm. Nellie packed up the kids and left her husband behind, never looking back. As a single woman with 3 children, money was tight, and Nellie worked constantly in order to provide for the family. As a result, Dorothy was thrust into the role of surrogate parent for her siblings, filling in for milestones big and small. As Louise told biography, Dorothy was the one who taught her to tie her shoes. She came to school open houses, talent shows, whatever activities Louise was involved in, Dorothy was there. As 14-year-old Dorothy entered high school at Centennial Secondary School in Coquitlam, which is a suburb of Vancouver, she got a job at the local Dairy Queen, not for spending money to buy records and perfume at the mall, but to help supplement her mother's meager income as a school cafeteria worker. Even with the added responsibility of a job and acting as a parent to her siblings, Dorothy managed to maintain straight A's in school. Dave Redlick, who was Dorothy's boss at the Dairy Queen, told biography that by the age of 14, Dorothy was, quote, tall and skinny, and she was quiet and kept to herself. At 5'9" with blonde hair and blue eyes, Dorothy had a cute figure and full lips, but like a lot of teenage girls, she didn't see anything special when she looked in the mirror. Family friend Helen Maleskew commented in biography that Dorothy, quote, thought she was the ugliest duckling that ever was, and would say, I'll never be beautiful. Her sister Louise told biography that Dorothy, quote, felt awkward about her looks, that kids teased her about her big lips, and that she wasn't comfortable in her own skin. Dorothy herself told BCTV in Canada, quote, I was very shy. I never dated boys. I never went out to parties. I was straight, very straight. I worked in a Dairy Queen for 4 years. I lived on the farm. I was a straight A student. I mean, you don't get any more wholesome than that. The Village Voice described Dorothy as, quote, a shy, comely, undistinguished teenager who wrote sophomore poetry and had no aspirations other than landing a secretarial job. Fate had other plans for Dorothy, though, and it came in the form of a hustler by the name of Paul Snider. Also a native of Vancouver, Paul grew up in the East End, which was kind of known as the Hood, and after his parents split up when he was a kid, Paul was pretty much on his own, even dropping out of school in the 7th grade in order to support himself. His brother Jeff said in biography that even at a young age, Paul wanted to be somebody. He bulked up his thin frame through bodybuilding, and with his dark good looks and immaculate attention to his appearance, Paul had no trouble attracting the ladies. Paul also has expensive tastes, driving his black Corvette around town while decked out in a mink, polyester pants, shirts open to his chest, a glittery Star of David necklace bouncing against his exposed chest hair. To support these tastes, Paul worked as a promoter for the Pacific National Exhibition, which is like a car and motorcycle show. But it's not enough. Paul wants more. More money, more cars, more prestige. To achieve that, he becomes a pimp. eventually heading south to LA to jumpstart his business. Except he wasn't all that good at it, and it's not long before he's back in cold Vancouver. And one night in 1978, he and a friend stop in a local Dairy Queen, and behind the counter is 17-year-old Dorothy. According to the Village Voice, Paul told his buddy, quote, "That girl could make me a lot of money." 26-year-old Paul got her number from one of the other girls working at the Dairy Queen and called Dorothy at home that night. Dave Redlick, Dorothy's boss, was not impressed. Telling Biography he considered Paul to be, quote, "a sneaky weasel," and that he just kind of popped up in the weirdest places, which I guess you can use your imagination on that one. He warned Dorothy to stay away from Paul, worried that she'd be out there turning tricks on street corners like every other girl in his life if she didn't watch out. As the Global News reported, quote, "He was entirely," meaning Paul, "he was entirely disliked by 90% of the people who knew him. He was very brash, very demanding, wanting to tell people how great Paul Snider was." For the family's part, Louise said that when Paul started coming around, nobody was impressed. And as family friend Helen Maleskew observed, it was easy for Paul to worm his way into the hen house because, one, Dorothy was a vulnerable girl. You know, she's very insecure about her looks, thinks nobody would ever want her. And two, there was no father figure to keep the wolf away. To 17-year-old Dorothy, the flashy, worldly older Paul must have seemed like a god. He's got, well, to the untrained eye anyway, he has nice clothes, a nice apartment, nice car, and jewelry. Dorothy, sweet from the farm Dorothy, she has never seen anything like Paul, and she's so innocent and so sheltered. In her mind, she probably thought he was some kind of a superstar. And he comes on strong with her. According to the Village Voice, in addition to showering Dorothy with clothes and diamonds, he'd cook for her, play the guitar, ply her with hot toddies. For a girl who thought she was an ugly duckling, getting this kind of attention, I mean, it probably blew her mind. Paul, even at the age of 26, he took Dorothy to her high school prom, which is kind of weird, right? It's kind of creepy. I mean, I guess if it's your boyfriend, like that's what you would do, but it's kind of, I don't know, something kind of strange about that. But most importantly, though, Paul did two things. One, he took charge. There hasn't been a man around the house for a long time, and there's no one there to be a protector, no one there to be the provider. And then here's Paul with his kind of larger-than-life presence and his success, which is pretty seductive. And after so many years of struggle, finally, here's someone who can shoulder some of the responsibility that Dorothy's been carrying on her shoulders for such a long time. Two, he tells Dorothy she's beautiful. And, you know, again, if you're a young girl who thinks of herself as an ugly duckling and someone who's never really dated boys, and suddenly here's this older, sophisticated guy telling you that you're beautiful, well, it's a powerful drug, and powerful drugs are hard to resist. To Paul, Dorothy was a shiny object, a means to an end, a real ticket to the big time, not like the dime a dozen girls he pimped out. As the Village Voice put it, Paul viewed Dorothy as, quote, class merchandise, and therefore had to be handled with care. And Paul handled Dorothy very carefully, as in he was grooming her, which essentially, you know, that's what you do when you're trying to get somebody to do something for them by doing things for them. Like you buy them gifts, you give them attention, you compliment them, you give them affection. And that's exactly what he did with Dorothy. And as Dorothy approaches her high school graduation, Paul kicks his campaign into high gear. As reported in the Village Voice, he bought Dorothy a special white gown with ruffles for her graduation dance, and afterward, he takes her to a photographer to sit for a professional portrait, saying she looked, quote, like a flirtatious virgin. Ooh. These harmless portraits were an entree to what Paul really wanted, which was to use Dorothy in order to grab the brass ring, which in the 70s was Playboy. At that time, Playboy Magazine was the hottest men's magazine in the country. With its mix of interviews, short stories, articles highlighting everything from LGBTQ rights to the feminist movement, coupled with, yes, provocative pictures of naked women. The Playboy brand represented prestige, hedonism, and sex. In other words, you read Playboy for the articles, which is what people would always say. Well, I'm not looking at the pictures, I'm reading the articles. Okay. According to the Village Voice, Paul had made some previous attempts at building the perfect Playboy bunny, but didn't get anywhere. In Paul's eyes, those girls didn't have Dorothy's wholesome beauty, her class. Those girls could not take him to the top, but Dorothy could. So, after already making Dorothy feel comfortable in her flirtatious virgin getup, about a month after that first photo shoot, Paul reached out to the same photographer to schedule another shoot. Except this time there would be no dresses to hide behind. The photographer, Uwe Meyer, showed up at Paul's apartment, and as he told the Village Voice, while she was nervous initially, using scarves and blouses to cover up, Uwe said that in time, Dorothy, quote, fell quickly into playful postures, and that she was perfectly pliant. As Uwe said, quote, she was eager to please and said, do whatever you like. Because Dorothy was underage at the time, before Paul could submit the pictures to Playboy, she not only had to fess up to her mother that she had posed for nude pictures, she also had to talk her into signing the consent form, which, after a whole lot of arguing, eventually Nellie gave in and she signed. With these signed release forms in hand, Paul tapped another photographer who had connections with Playboy to take some additional test shots. And in the summer of 1978, Dorothy's test shots were on their way to Los Angeles. And by August, so was Dorothy, boarding a plane for the first time in her life to head to LA for a test shot and the chance to compete for the 25th anniversary Great Playmate Hunt. ABC News contributor Chris Connolly commented to 2020, quote, when they saw Dorothy, they saw someone who was fresh, almost seemingly unaware of the effect her nudity had on men. In other words, she was the epitome of the sexy girl next door. And all the things that she thought were a liability, being tall, her big lips, now they're an asset. By now, having been rechristened Dorothy Stratten, she wasn't chosen for the 25th anniversary Great Playmate Hunt, but she was named Playboy's Miss August 1979 and even became a bunny at the Playboy Club in Los Angeles. So, in the span of less than a year, Dorothy Stratten has gone from slinging blizzards and dilly bars at the Dairy Queen in Vancouver to gracing the pages of Playboy Magazine. I mean, I don't know if it's the American dream, but it's definitely the stuff of Hollywood legend. Her whole world changed, blink of an eye. Remember, she'd never even been on a plane before traveling to LA to meet with Playboy. As actress Marielle Hemingway said to 2020, quote, can you imagine having never left this small town and working at the Dairy Queen to come to Hollywood to end up at parties where people are drinking cocktails that you've never even seen a cocktail before? Everything about your experience is brand new. Once Dorothy was chosen as Playmate of the Month, Paul immediately flew out to LA and the two moved in together. And like any good pimp, Paul makes absolutely no move to get a job, reasoning that Dorothy should be the one bringing home the bacon and serving it up for them both. In his mind, if it wasn't for him, she'd still be manning the soft-serve machine at Dairy Queen, so she owed him. While Paul's slickster act barely worked in Vancouver, he's really the square peg in the round hole in LA, mainly because he creeped people out. Max Baer Jr., best known for playing Jethro on the Beverly Hillbillies, met Paul and Dorothy once they were in LA, and just like Dorothy's boss at the Dairy Queen, Dave, who called Paul a sneaky weasel, Max didn't trust Paul either, telling 2020 about the guy, quote, if you shake hands, meaning if you shake hands with Paul, you count your fingers after you do it. As a playmate, Dorothy, and by extension Paul, were granted entree to the Playboy Mansion, which long before Girls Next Door and that whole thing, it was like Studio 54 in New York, the hottest spot in town with glitz, glamour, sex in every corner of every room. Dorothy was easily absorbed into and lauded by this world, while Paul the pimp was exposed for what he was. Playmate Victoria Cook, who went to the parties at the mansion, told 2020 that Paul, quote, had the fur coats to the floor, the chains, the silk black shirts. He was just such a cartoon character. Eric Roberts, the actor, he went on to play Paul in a movie, told 2020 that Paul was, quote, offensive, that he looked small time, he dressed small time, sounded small time, he acted small time. Gina Keogh, who is probably best known for being a real housewife of Orange County, and she was in all those really cool ZZ Top videos back in the 80s, and she was also a Playmate, she shared with 2020 that Paul, who has Dorothy frickin' Stratten on his arm, was caught in the mansion's intimate grotto with another woman, which I can't imagine why another woman would want to be with him, but okay. But at any rate, that got him banned from the mansion, and he was only allowed onto the property if Dorothy was with him. Dorothy, however, she's got other things on her plate than getting Paul into the mansion because her career is really taking off. She has very quickly moved from posing for the camera to acting for it. She booked jobs for the movies Americathon and Skate Town, and even scores the lead in the film Autumn Born. While Dorothy was keeping busy with modeling and acting, Paul did eventually get off his butt, and he was doing things like promoting wet t-shirt contests, wet underwear contests, which I didn't even know that was a thing, but okay. And also, this was kind of interesting, he was a promoter for the original Chippendales clubs, which it wasn't yet the gold mine it became, but there was potential there. And actually, it was Dorothy who was the one who came up with the idea for the male dancers to wear the collar and cuffs that came to define the Chippendales look. And that's because the collar and cuffs mirrored the uniform of the bunnies at the Playboy Club where Dorothy worked. Well, Paul doesn't get to ride the Chippendales rocket to the top because the guys who were running the place, they liked the concept and they saw the potential, but they didn't want Paul anywhere near it, so they cut him out. Gone. And even though the Chippendales gravy train passes him by, he still has cash cow Dorothy, and he never lets her forget it. According to the Village Voice, he was fond of reminding her that they had a, quote, lifetime bargain, which meant marriage. Now, you know that once he clamps that wedding ring on her finger, she's not getting away from him. She's going to be chained to him. And she seemed to sense that because she hesitated to marry Paul. And if she was unsure, her friends were super sure, super clear, that she should not, under any circumstances, marry this guy. Part of Dorothy's uncertainty was the gratitude she felt toward him, not only for her career, but for what she perceived as his emotional support. You know, like you're this simple girl from Canada, and overnight, literally, you've shot to the top, and clinging to Paul, the guy who brought you here, the guy that you feel you owe your success to. I mean, it kind of makes sense psychologically. She's just wanting a little bit of normalcy, something to hold on to. As the Village Voice reported, according to friends, Dorothy would say, quote, he cares for me so much. He's always there when I need him. I can't ever imagine myself being with any other man but Paul. And so, on June 1st, 1979, Dorothy succumbed, marrying Paul in a secret ceremony in Las Vegas. There were no well wishes for the newly married couple because, in fact, people were mortified that she'd actually gone through with it. Paul, however, has no problem with it because he slides into being Mr. Dorothy Hoogstraten like a snake across the grass. After the wedding, they rented a room in a 2-story Spanish-style home in West LA that was owned by Stephen Kushner, a doctor who hung out at the Playboy Club. The doctor wasn't around much, so Paul and Dorothy pretty much had the run of the place. Paul took on the decorating, if you can call it that, plastering the walls of the house with pictures of Dorothy, blathering on about how one day the two of them would live in Bel Air, which was one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country, that Dorothy would be crowned Playmate of the Year in 1980. He believed in that dream so much, he even went so far as to get personalized license plates for his new Mercedes, which bought with Dorothy's money, as if that was a question. The plates for this new Mercedes read Star 80, which represented everything he thought about Dorothy. She was going to be his star in the coming year. Paul was becoming increasingly fixated on controlling every aspect of his creation, which is really how he saw Dorothy. His property, his star, his meal ticket. And he kept her on an incredibly tight leash, monitoring every aspect of her life, from what she ate to what she wore, who was she with, what was she doing, where was she going, just every single thing she did. He wanted to know about it. He wanted to be right there, glued to her hip. He was so focused on Dorothy shooting straight to the top. He was even okay with it if she had to sleep with Hugh Hefner to do it, because, pimp, once a pimp, always a pimp. To be noted, Hugh Hefner has always denied that he ever slept with Dorothy. Absolutely not. Never happened. Although Dorothy didn't say it, Paul's obsession with her, it was just becoming too much. It's just understandable. And while she may have seen him initially as an anchor, in the sense that she felt like he supported her and kept her grounded amidst the craziness of her life, the reality is he was dragging her down. Despite the turmoil of dealing with Paul, as 1979 comes to a close, her star continues to rise as she books roles on some of the hottest TV shows, including Buck Rogers and Fantasy Island, and the feature film Galaxina. And the capper of this whirlwind year, Dorothy made Paul's dream come true when she was chosen as Playmate of the Year 1980, the first Canadian to earn the honor. This honorific naturally meant Paul is ever more glued to her, and in a bid to attach himself to her even more forever, he wanted say-so over her finances, over the movies she was in, wanted her to take the money she got for being Playmate of the Year and buy them a house. Smartly, she had a business manager who wasn't Paul, and the money she was making was going into Dorothy Hoogstraten Enterprises, which Paul was not an officer of. Even though Dorothy had been able to resist his demands, it was becoming harder and harder to free herself from his grasp. A chance for escape came in the form of a movie called They All Laughed, starring Audrey Hepburn and John Ritter, and directed by Peter Bogdanovich, who was a super hot Oscar-nominated director at the time. Among the classic films he directed were The Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, which won 10-year-old Tatum O'Neal an Oscar, and Mask with Cher and Eric Stoltz. So, serious pedigree, big change from the frankly craptastic feature films Dorothy's doing. I mean, I don't think Galaxina was going in the National Register of, historic films for preservation. Peter and Dorothy meet at the Playboy Mansion, and according to Roseanne Catton Walden, who was a fellow Playmate, Dorothy, no surprise, she didn't even know who the guy was. She had no clue that he's this big-time director. And despite her not knowing who he is, Peter is so charmed by her, and he is inspired to flesh out what was originally a small, one-off role in They All Laughed to a co-starring role. So he's giving her a much bigger part in this movie. Once she's officially cast, she prepares to head to New York, where the movie would film. Paul, of course, wanted to come, but there's no reason for him to be there. For one, it was a closed set, and what else is he going to do but try to clamp himself around her ankles all day long? She managed to convince him that it would be better for him to stay in LA, and free as a bird, off Dorothy went to New York. So, as it turned out, Dorothy was doing a little bit more than just filming a movie. She and Peter are having an affair. It's all very hush-hush, totally top secret, and amazingly, nobody on set knew about it. That's how well they kept it a secret. Back in LA, a sulking, desperate Paul can tell that something is off with Dorothy. Eventually, she stopped taking his calls, which of course is a big warning sign. And Dorothy, she's chafing against the restraints that Paul had on her, and she begged him to just let go. But he's not going to let go of his golden goose, his ticket to the top, his star 80. So Dorothy had to do it for him. In June of 1980, a year after their Vegas wedding, she had him served with separation papers. She closed out their joint accounts and put him on an allowance. Desperate to recreate the magic he discovered with Dorothy, Paul decides to get back up on the horse when he meets a 17-year-old grocery store clerk, Patty Larman. Just like Dorothy, he hoped he could groom her and eventually peddle her to Playboy, which they said, no way, not buying what you're selling, bud. Regardless of this failed experiment, Patty moves into the same house that Dorothy and Paul share with Dr. Kushner. Paul is still not done trying to score off of Dorothy's name and image. He has the idea of selling a poster of Dorothy in roller skates and not much else. And, back then posters were a big commodity. Like we think of the Farrah Fawcett's iconic 1976 poster, which went on to sell 12 million copies. Paul, as usual, he's got dollar signs in his eyes, and he's thinking, okay, we do this poster with Dorothy, boom, we're going to sell millions of copies, and I'll get a percentage of that. I'll get some of those millions. And even though Dorothy had initially agreed to do the poster, she changed her mind, thus severing one of Paul's last shots at the big time. Paul continues to try and get Dorothy back, eventually hiring a private detective to prove she was having an affair with Peter. And although the guy did find some evidence, I guess there were some letters or something that he found, Paul was starting to realize that he really wasn't a match for the wealthy and powerful Peter Bogdanovich, someone who had actual clout, actual cachet. According to the Village Voice, Paul confided to a friend that, quote, maybe this thing is too big for me. Supposedly, he even talked about just throwing in the towel and heading home to Vancouver. Just another Hollywood dreamer chewed up and spit out by the machine. But he just couldn't let go of Dorothy. He cried. He wrote her love letters. The Village Voice reported that he even wrote a letter to Peter, quote, telling him to quit influencing Dorothy and that he, meaning Paul, would forgive him. I really doubt Peter Bogdanovich was sitting around waiting for Paul Snider's forgiveness, but, the things we tell ourselves. According to Patty, quote, Paul was distraught. There were times when he talked to me and he would start crying. He would sit on the couch and play his guitar, and he wrote songs to Dorothy. Dorothy, meanwhile, she is out there doing the damn thing. She is fielding offers left and right for all kinds of prestige projects, including Charlie's Angels, playing Marilyn Monroe in a TV movie, more feature film offers, personal appearances. Oh, and once she got back from New York from filming the movie, she moved into Peter's Bel Air mansion, the same dream that Paul had for them. Originally, Dorothy had told Paul she was living in an apartment in Beverly Hills, but Paul figures it out, realizes that no, she must be living with Peter Bogdanovich. And desperate to get to her, he borrows a gun and heads over to the estate, sequestering himself under the cover of darkness, determined to shoot anyone who tried to come onto the property. Nothing happened, though, fortunately, and Paul gave up. And according to an article in Playboy about Dorothy, Paul would later confess to friends that he thought about taking his own life that night. Despite cutting ties with Paul, Dorothy still felt a sense of responsibility for her soon-to-be ex-husband, wanting to make sure he was still financially taken care of after their divorce. So, on August 8th, 1980, Dorothy decided to meet Paul at the house they had been living in previously, her intention being that she wanted to reassure him she wasn't going to completely abandon him financially. Paul, however, took the lunch invitation as a sign that she was coming back to him, that he was getting another chance with her, and he was not going to blow it. Well, once Dorothy told him she was in love with Peter, and she wanted to figure out some kind of settlement for him, Paul, he's stunned. He's blown away because he has completely misread the tea leaves. A despondent Paul agreed to meet with Dorothy the following week to finalize some of the details of the settlement that she wanted to give him. Then Dorothy took some of the things that she still had at the house and left. What Dorothy could not have known is that this meeting with Paul would trigger an unstoppable chain of inconceivably horrific events. So remember the gun that Paul had borrowed when he was stalking Dorothy and Peter outside of Peter's house. Well, the owner wanted it back. And Paul, having gotten a taste, he becomes determined to get another one. So since Paul and Dorothy were still both Canadian citizens, he couldn't legally buy a gun in America. So instead, he asked this private eye that he had hired to follow Dorothy, he asked him to buy him a machine gun for, as the Village Voice reported, quote, home protection. Now, the guy's, he's not stupid. He realizes Paul wants it for another purpose, and he said, look, man, whatever you're thinking, don't do it. Paul pretends like he's given up the idea, but no, he had not. He found a 12-gauge Mossberg pump shotgun listed for sale by owner in the newspaper and drove out to the San Fernando Valley with the intention of buying it. However, it was nighttime, and Paul got lost, so he had to turn around and head home. He did get in touch with the owner later on, and the two agreed to meet at a local construction site where the owner showed Paul how to load and fire the gun before selling it to him. According to the Village Voice, a few days before he was to meet with Dorothy about the settlement, Paul was in a great mood. He's telling friends that he's looking for houses as an investment for Dorothy, and they said he was, quote, relaxed and jovial, even as he was rambling on about nonsensical things. And one of those oddball musings is actually quite chilling. He makes a reference to fellow playmate Claudia Jennings, who had died the previous fall in a car accident, saying, quote, some playmates get killed, and when that happens, it causes a lot of chaos. August 14th, 1980. Dorothy and Paul have agreed to meet in order to hash out the final details of the financial settlement she wants to give him in order to be free of him and get on with her life. Before heading over to the house to meet Paul, Dorothy spends the morning with her business manager getting, among other things, some advice on how to handle the settlement. He gave her good advice, which was the exact same thing that both Peter and Hugh Hefner had told her, which was, that unfortunately she did not take, which was to let the lawyers handle it. Don't spend 1 minute more with this guy. Gina Keogh told 2020, quote, Hef and Peter kind of forbid her from going to see him. They forbid it. She had to sneak. She had to lie. She just misjudged that guy so badly. She just had that little flaw, not being able to see the evil in people. And it's because of that flaw that Dorothy earnestly believes that by dealing with Paul herself, by not going through lawyers and strangers, it will ultimately make the split easier, more humane, will honor what they had and what he did for her. What she can't see, though, is that Paul is a grasping, cheap, small, desperate nobody. She even held out the naive hope that they could remain close, saying, according to the Playboy article, quote, I'd like to remain his friend. Dorothy leaves her business manager's office to meet Paul. She has $1,100 in her purse, a purported good faith down payment to the settlement she plans to propose to him. She's probably thinking, I'll give him the money, we'll reminisce, there will probably be some tears, but we'll part on good terms. Everything will be okay. There's some dispute about what time Dorothy arrived at the house, but it was sometime late morning, early afternoon, when she pulled up and parked her 1967 Mercury and locked it. Paul had his private eye stashed outside the house, and not long after Dorothy arrived, he called Paul, who assured him, speaking in code apparently, that everything's just great. All throughout the afternoon, that private detective keeps calling Paul, but he does not pick up the phone. At 5 o'clock that evening, Patty comes home with one of her friends. They see Dorothy's car and that the door to Paul's bedroom is closed. It's quiet, and the assumption is that Paul is there, but that he wanted privacy. The two girls go skating, getting back to the house around 7. The owner of the house, Dr. Kushner, he comes home and he sees the closed door. The phone continues to ring unanswered behind that closed door. Finally, just before midnight, the private eye asks Patty to go and knock on the door. The doctor's the one that agrees to it, though, even though he doesn't really want to. Between the incessantly ringing phone and the weird way that his German Shepherd is acting. So his German Shepherd's in the backyard. And the backyard, Paul's bedroom window, faces the backyard. The dog is back there. He's whining, he's pacing, and something's off. So the whole thing gives Dr. Kushner a bad feeling. Nevertheless, he knocks on Paul's door. No answer. He decides to push the door open and then immediately slams it shut again. What he saw was blood, spattered across the window curtains, the walls, the TV. Dorothy and Paul are both nude. Dorothy was kneeling on the carpet, the top half of her body sprawled across the bottom corner of the bed. She had been shot in the face with that 12-gauge shotgun right above her left eye, the bones of her face smashed to oblivion. Bloody handprints were imprinted against her bottom and left leg. She'd been sexually assaulted. Clumps of her hair were clenched in Paul's right hand. Paul is face down on the ground, parallel to the foot of the bed. The muzzle of the shotgun burned his cheek, the bullet exploding through the top of his head. Like Dorothy, his face is obliterated. Small black ants crawled across their bodies. Instead of falling backward, Paul fell forward and was found slumped over the length of the shotgun. Patty told 2020, quote, "It looked like a horror movie, a staged horror movie, like mannequins and fake blood. That's a picture that never goes away, a mental picture that's stuck in here forever." Paul Snider was 29 years old. Dorothy Stratten was 20 years old. Dorothy's purse with the $1,100 was found laying open in the middle of the living room floor. There was a note in Paul's handwriting bemoaning the state of his life. He didn't have a green card, so he couldn't work, which meant he needed Dorothy to support him. She was prepared to offer him a flat amount of $7,500, but that wasn't enough to support Paul in the lifestyle that he thought he should become accustomed to. He was losing Dorothy in more ways than one, and he wanted compensation. Marielle Hemingway observed to 2020, quote, "As she, Dorothy, started to slip away, he started to realize he owned nothing. He wasn't doing anything. Nobody was admiring him. Hugh Hefner's not going to call him back. And then this deep, 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 freaky thing that was going on inside of him took control, and he lost it. And because he couldn't have Dorothy, he couldn't have her money, couldn't have her clout, he decided, well, then you know what? Nobody gets her. Not Hugh Hefner, not Peter Bogdanovich, nobody." He was basically saying, I brought Dorothy to you, well, guess what? I can take her away, too. As Dr. Kushner told 2020, quote, "He ultimately had to do what he did, and basically to Hefner, to Bogdanovich, to everyone else, to society in general, put up not one, but two middle fingers and say, that's what you get for messing with Paul Snider." Authorities believe Paul sexually assaulted and shot Dorothy inside of an hour after she got to the house, taking his own life approximately 1 hour later. Dorothy was cremated, her ashes interred at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, which ironically is also the final resting place of Marilyn Monroe, who Dorothy had been compared to and who she was considering playing in a TV movie. Paul Snider's body was returned to Vancouver. Peter Bogdanovich supported Dorothy's family financially, with her mother Nellie and little sister Louise eventually moving into his house in Bel Air. In 1984, he published the book The Killing of the Unicorn, Dorothy Stratten, 1960 to 1980. And then in, let's just say, a weird twist, Peter married Dorothy's little sister Louise on December 30th, 1988, when he was 49 and Louise was 20, which ironically was the same age that Dorothy was when she died. Well, at any rate, they got divorced in 2001. And Peter would go on to direct more movies, though he really never reached the zenith that he had during the height of the 70s, his popularity in the 70s. He did direct more films, like I said, and he did actually become more visible for his acting roles, including a popular stint on The Sopranos. Peter Bogdanovich died in 2022 at the age of 82. Dorothy's final film, They All Laughed, which Peter had directed, flopped at the box office, though the movie does have its fans, including Quentin Tarantino. 2 movies would be made about Dorothy: the TV movie Death of a Centerfold, the Dorothy Stratten story starring Jamie Lee Curtis and Bruce Weitz in 1980, and the Bob Fosse-directed feature Star 80 in 1983 with Mariel Hemingway and Eric Roberts. The Star 80 comes from Paul's license plates, the personalized license plates, describing how he saw Dorothy. Star 80, his star in 1980. The epitaph on Stratton's grave, which Peter chose, is a passage from the Ernest Hemingway novel A Farewell to Arms. So it's another interesting little Hemingway connection, because Mariel Hemingway is Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter, and she played Dorothy in Star 80. But the epitaph reads, in part, "If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them. So, of course, it kills them." Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. Also, while you're there, you can find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus features and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.